Hello and welcome to another episode of the Scripting Dead podcast. It's me again, Fernando. And in this episode, which I'm expecting it to be a little longer than usual, I want to share with you some specific nuggets of insight I've gotten from the past 20 years of experience as a developer. And things I've seen, things I've done wrong, and things I've seen others do that I just don't agree with, that I think that might just be the wrong way of going about it as a developer. So these are just like 9 pieces of advice that I'll leave with you in this episode. I hope you find it interesting. So the first one is to leave your ego at the door. There is nothing worse than a developer that just can't recognize when they're wrong, or can just quote unquote lower themselves enough to ask for help. Sadly, this is a very common thing that I've seen. Developers usually tend to have a big ego. I think, in my opinion, that this is because we tend to see ourselves as creators at some point. We write our code, we make this thing that didn't exist before come alive. Either whatever type of developer you are, I'm sure you can sympathize with that. I'm sure you at some point you've felt like a god. Clearly, probably the next minute you felt like an idiot because you were missing a semicolon somewhere and you had a stupid bug. But at some point, the peaks of the day, we feel that way. And whenever someone shows us that we're wrong, or even whenever someone points out a problem with our code, with our baby, essentially, the thing that we created, that we wrote, and that we're so proud of, then it's really hard to just ignore that inner voice that we have that shouts that everyone's wrong and that we're right. But we should ignore it. The ego, it doesn't really help you in any way in this situation. As developers, one thing that we should always embrace is that chances are we're wrong. Chances are we're missing something if everything that we care about is our only vision, is our only point of view. So, whether we're solving a problem, whether we're creating something new, whatever we're doing with code, if we only care and if we only pay attention to our own point of view, then chances are we are missing something. We are making assumptions, and we are missing someone else's point of view. So whether you're doing code review, whether a colleague of yours just points out your logic is faulty, just my advice here: just leave the ego at the door the minute you start working as a developer. That way, you'll learn faster, you'll benefit from your interactions with other developers, and just accept that better ideas than yours might come from the outside. They might come from other developers, and that's just fine. What they're doing is not proving you're wrong, it's just showing you a different way of doing things. Next time you face a similar problem, you'll have more tools because you decided to not pay attention to your ego, because you decided to listen to others. So that's the first advice. The second one is that to remember that languages, whatever language you're using for programming, they're just tools. If you only focus on one, then your view of how to solve problems is going to be biased by the choices that the language creators made. That a language usually follows one or more paradigms. You have languages like, let's say, Java, that is mostly object-oriented. It's strongly object-oriented. might now be incorporated some aspect of functional programming, but historically it's been object-oriented. You might have others like Haskell, for example, pure functional programming language that also gives you the tools to solve the same kind of problem, if you will. You could solve the same kind of problem through Haskell and Java, but you would do it in different ways. Now, if you only focus on one of them, then the way you'll tackle every single problem is going to be the same. Why is this a problem then? Because even if you're not going to work using other programming languages, just studying them and trying them out, and especially if they give you, if they use a different paradigm than the one you're used to using, they will show you a different way of solving the same problems you've been tackling so far. Now you can go back to your chosen language and try to solve these problems either using the exact method that that other language showed you, or using something different, something in between, something that mixes both worlds. The point here is that when you come back to your language of choice, you are a richer programmer, if you will. So my recommendation here is to get out of your comfort zone. Learn about other languages, even though you might not need them in your day-to-day. Several years ago, I read a great book that showed me exactly this. The book is called 7 Languages in 7 Weeks. I'll try to add a link to it on the show notes. But if I forget for some reason, just Google it. You'll find it. You'll just reading this book, it's not going to take you 7 weeks, but it's definitely going to show you 7 completely different languages, how they solve different problems, and why they were created, the kind of advantages that they bring. You go back after reading that book, you'll go back to your day-to-day knowing different ways that you can tackle the same problems, even if you don't end up using any of those languages in the future. You'll definitely have more tools at your disposal. So learn about new languages. Now, third one, and this is a very important one, especially if you're just getting started, because this is a very common question that a lot of new developers make. It's not about memorizing algorithms. It's just about knowing how to Google them fast enough, or also about how to ask ChatGPT the right question. Essentially, what I'm trying to say here is, as developers, we can't just know everything. It's just not possible. I mean, especially if you jump from one framework to the other, from one language to the other throughout your career, you can't possibly keep remembering every single piece of syntax of every language. You can't possibly remember how to implement every single algorithm out of the blue without any tool, without anything that will remember you. I mean, hardly any developer will use everything that they learn throughout their career, throughout their formative years. It's just not, our mind doesn't work that way, and you're not expected to remember everything. Luckily, we have, when we're working, we usually have internet access. And that means at least you have the ability to Google for something. You have the ability to Google how to implement, a login process, or how to implement, a bubble sort for some reason. You're trying to implement that. The point here is that you should not, you'll never be expected to remember everything by heart. And if you are, then probably there's something wrong with that team. There's something wrong with that manager. But that's just inhuman. And especially now that we have tools like ChatGPT, leave Google aside. You can not only ask for a page that might have a solution to your problem. You can literally ask for the solution to your problem and get a close enough piece of code that you can then use. Then why the heck would you be expected to remember something if the machine can remember it for you? You're there to use that piece of code and create something bigger with it. So that's why you're there. You're not there to remember how to implement the observer pattern or whatever. Just remember that. It doesn't matter if you're a senior developer, a junior developer. You might know more things now or in the future, but that doesn't really matter. In the end, you can absolutely Google for help or use your favorite AI tool. If it's Copilot, whatever. You just use it. Make the most of these tools because they will make you a better developer. Now, the next one is something I already hinted at, but essentially is, as a developer, you'll always be learning your entire career. If you think that you did college or you did a boot camp or you just spent maybe the last year going through tutorials and maybe trying them out and seeing and learning from them, and now that you feel comfortable, you got a job, and then you say, well, I'm done learning, now I just want to work. Wrong. It couldn't be more wrong, actually. As a developer, you'll always be learning your entire career. The minute you stop learning, then you stop growing as a developer. Others next to you who don't stop will surpass you, will get the better job, get the better salary. This is not about competing, it's just how the industry works. Every year we get new languages, we get new ways of doing the same thing or even new things. The AI revolution that started about a year ago has shown us that as developers, we are ready to take the next step. We are ready to start doing more complex things on our own, thanks to these complex or more powerful tools like ChatGPT, like Copilot, but they are only as useful to you as you learn to use them as a developer. I don't know if that makes sense. The point is, they're not gonna do your job for you. They're there to help you improve. So you have to keep learning. You have to stay up to date with the industry. You have to have some sort of eye in the industry. Either it's through Twitter or through some other influencers that you might find yourself following, through maybe podcasts like this. The point is, you have to keep an eye out there and maybe an ear as well, and see what people are talking about, what kind of new developments are there, and what sticks out of everything new that comes out in a year. Those things that stick are probably going to be forming the next standard for the industry. So you should pay attention to it. You should probably learn that new framework if it's been around, and people are still talking about it for more than 3 months. You should probably listen. You should probably look into that new language that's been there for about a year and you haven't really touched. Why? Who knows? Maybe you'll learn something new. Maybe you'll get a new job out of it. Maybe you'll find the new thing that's hot and that will catapult your progress as a developer, to new heights. The point is, the minute you stop doing this, that's it. You can just kiss your job goodbye, because eventually someone else will come and they'll replace you. So don't ever stop learning. Now, another thing that I want to touch on is a very common phrase, actually, but not something that a lot of developers tend to agree with or tend to follow, and that is the mantra of working is better than perfect. Say it with me again. Working is better than perfect. When you have a deadline to deliver a feature, to deliver a product, to release a product to production or whatever, nobody cares if your code is perfect. The user cares if the feature works. The user cares if they can play the game. The user cares if they can sign in or sign out into your app. How the code looks in the back end or in the front end, nobody cares. I'm sorry to say it. Only you care about it. And there's nothing wrong about caring about the quality of your code. That's something that you should always do, but with some limitations. Because in the real world, you have other constraints. There are budget constraints, time constraints that you have to follow. So you can't really spend 2 weeks, a month over the stated timeline just because you can't get your code to be perfect. It doesn't really matter. As long as it works, you can move on. Yes, maybe you can go back and fix it in the future, or maybe that code, the ugly code that you wrote, will stay there forever. Nobody's going to blame you. Don't worry about it. There's this thing called technical debt that, poorly written code adds up over time and creates problem within application. And definitely that is something that teams should work towards fixing, should plan to fix at some point, or at least to keep under certain limits, essentially, because getting rid of all technical debt is kind of a wish. I don't think that's even possible, but keep it under control is definitely something that teams as a whole should work on and should plan for. But you, as a single developer, you should always aim at delivering your work on time. It doesn't mean delivering poor quality code when you can avoid it. It just means that you should not over-engineer your solutions. You should plan accordingly to make sure that what you write works and gives the users the expected outcome. If it follows the perfect pattern, or if it's fully documented, or if it uses the best naming conventions, nobody really cares. Perfect doesn't really exist, and if you aim for perfect, you'll never stop touching and tweaking your code. On a related note, the next advice, which I always tend to give it to new developers, is when they're getting started and they're trying to solve a problem, they sometimes never finish fiddling with the code because they try to make it perfect or super optimized from the get-go. People call it early optimization, essentially, trying to optimize every line of code before you move on to the next one and make it not only look good but also be as fast as possible, trying to avoid nested loops and so on, before actually having a working solution to the problem. My advice here is make it work, then optimize. It's similar to the previous one where I said perfect doesn't exist, just make it work. Now, this is not about not aiming for perfection. This is about the order of things, the order of how you tackle a problem, a solution to a problem. You don't try to aim for perfection from the get-go. You just write ugly code that solves the problem. The minute you solve that problem, I don't care if you use, you nested 3-4 loops within each other and the code runs super slow and it consumes too much memory. I don't care. The point here is that you literally proved that there is a solution to the problem. You just proved that there is a potential algorithm that can solve the problem. Now, once you get to that point, it's where you say, okay, now let's optimize it. Now let's make it workable. You can even think that this advice goes before the previous one. Just make it work, and then once it's workable, it solves the problem, then improve it to a point where it's deliverable, and then just stop. Move on to the next problem. Don't aim for perfection, and don't try to aim for perfection or optimization from the get-go, because that's another huge problem that will literally put you on an endless loop, essentially. The main problem with this early optimization thing is that it's a trap, essentially. You can't optimize something that doesn't work, because to optimize something, to optimize an algorithm, you usually make assumptions, to remove cycles, to remove unnecessary things that you might, checks or things that you might never need, because you're making that assumption. This particular condition is never going to happen, so I can actually remove this if statement or this function call that is taking too much time to complete. Things like that. But how can you make those assumptions if you haven't really finished the algorithm? That's the problem with early optimization. You first have to finish your code. It doesn't matter how it looks. It doesn't matter how good or bad it is. You just have to finish it. And then, once it works, optimize it. Make the proper assumptions based on the solution you found. The next one is less about code and more about projects themselves. And this is good to understand, especially if you're working on your own product, if you're working on your own project. As developers, we tend to think that we can really, build any product. If you've been working as a web developer for a while, you probably see an application and say, well, I can build that. If you've been in game development for a while, you probably see a game and say, well, I can build that game. I have the tools. Now, the code, you have to remember that coding a project is just part of it. There are a lot of things that go around the project itself that are just not related to code. So I like to say that the last 10% of a project will take 90% of your effort. And that's true. If you're a developer, you'll spend what you think is 90% of the project itself, or the time you allotted to that to create this product, coding. And the last 10% where you say, well, now I have to just, get a few things right, probably get a few graphics, or do a little bit marketing here, or create this website. That whole extra thing that is no coding is going to take you 90% of the time. It's just how it works. It doesn't, clearly it depends on your context, who your client is, and a lot of other factors, but there's always something. So remember, when you think you're almost done with your code, you're probably forgetting about something. You're probably forgetting that there are a lot of details that are coming after the code that will take a lot of time. And if you're not familiar with these things, like, for example, marketing for developers, then they're going to take a lot of time for you to learn about and to get them right. So just remember that and keep that as part of your planning, so you don't get any surprises along the way. Now, back to coding. Another thing that I usually like to say is if you're doing it more than once, then you probably need to abstract it. Granted, there are some conditions where that might not be ideal, but if you're writing code and you happen to write two pieces, the same logic, it doesn't really have to be the same code, but you're doing the same task essentially more than once, then you probably can grab that, the generic parts of that logic and take them into an abstraction that you can then reuse. Remember, abstraction allows you to centralize part of code that gets reused across different parts of your project. That way, whenever you have to improve it, change it, or extend it, you only have to do it in one place, and you don't have to go through different sections of the project looking for the piece of code to update. This is great, especially if the project is big. This is great, especially if the group, the team that is working on this is big as well, because they don't have to keep track of who's adding what where. Everything's centralized and they know where to find it. So if you're doing it more than once, you probably need to abstract it. Remember that. Finally, and this is also a very controversial topic on our industry, side projects. The thing is, and this is how I see it, because there are a lot of people who believe that developers must absolutely be working on side projects to be great developers. And there are others who simply say, fuck it, I don't care. You don't really have to create side projects if you work for big enterprises, or if you work for whatever company actually. To me, in my experience, the ideal spot is in the middle, somewhere in the middle. Side projects, in my experience, are not a must on our industry. and in our career. To grow as a developer, you don't have to absolutely have or work on side projects, but they definitely help if you do. Why? I always like to make the comparison with athletes, essentially. I mean, I know it's not the same, but bear with me. Professional athletes are not the ones who, especially the successful ones, are not the ones who just go to their training session every day and then just train for 5, 6, 8 hours a day and then just do something else during the entire day. Professional athletes, the ones that actually make it, the ones the names of, they live for their sport. They train when they have to, and then they train later on. They adjust their entire lives, essentially, their diet, whatever they do on their free time, who they spend time with. They do it all around what they want to achieve, essentially, the greatness in their field. Then why do we think that as developers we shouldn't be working as hard? I mean, again, this is not a must. To be a successful developer means different things for different people. If you want to have a quiet life, if you want to have your job and a monthly salary, you don't absolutely have to have side projects. You don't really need to practice even more after 8 hours of coding daily. You're absolutely fine. But if you want to, be known in the field for, whatever in the industry, in whatever area you work with, as a web developer, as a game developer, or maybe a data scientist, whatever your role is, and if you want to excel over the rest of the industry, then side projects are a great way to get started. They'll give you time to practice things that you don't usually practice during your working hours. They'll give you ideas ways to solve problems during your day-to-day that you usually don't think of, or even problems that you don't face during your day-to-day. And they'll allow you to create projects that help others, other developers. If that's what you want, you can create open source projects, or you can create closed source projects as well. But they will let you, with side projects, you can work on whatever you want, essentially. You can be a web developer on your 9 to 5 and then create indie games as side projects on your, off hours. You can make extra money. You can learn things that you will apply later on your day-to-day. There are many things that you can do and you can get from side projects. The question is whether you want to or not. Maybe whether you need those things in your life or not. So no, you don't need to work on side projects to be a great developer and to work as one and to even get a job as one. You don't really need side projects, but they have benefits. So consider working on them if you want something out, if you feel like you have places where you are falling behind, for example, in comparison to your teammates. Maybe side projects might help you. If you create side projects around those topics, they'll force you to learn and to step up your game in that area, for example. That might be a good reason for it. And that's it. Those are my 9 pieces of advice that I've gotten over 20 years working as a developer. So remember, 1 is just leave your ego at the door. 2 will be languages are just tools. Just learn as many of them as you can and use them wisely. 3 is it's not about memorizing algorithms. It's just knowing how to Google them or use the right tool to get the implementation that you need, and just use that. 4 is remember that you'll be learning throughout your entire career. This never stops. 5 is working is better than perfect. Remember that. Working is better than perfect, which goes with the next one. make it work, and then optimize it as much as you can without going crazy. 7, the last 10% of any project will take out 90% of the time. It's just, how it works. 8, if you're doing it more than once, then you probably need to abstract it. And 9, side projects aren't mandatory, but they definitely help. And that's it. I hope that one of these 9 points at least made it through and was useful to you in some regard. If you did, please reach out. I would love to know what you think about this. Also, I'm looking for options to create a community around the podcast. So if you'd be interested in joining a Discord server or some other kind of interaction, maybe an X community or something like that, let me know. Reach out and we'll create something for everyone. All right. Thank you, and I'll catch you on the next one. And that was it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget to rate the podcast in your favorite podcasting app so that it can reach more developers. In the meantime, if you'd like to follow me on Twitter or X, as people call it, just look for me at DeleteMan123. And that's it. Thank you, and catch you on the next one.